So, greetings. Hello, this is Dr. Thomas Daffin speaking, and I'm talking to my Patreon community here in France. It's actually June the 20th, so we're talking just on the day before the midsummer solstice, which is a very important day for many people throughout the world, particularly in Europe and Britain. It's a Druid festival, generally a pagan festival all over Sweden. People stay up all night dancing under the stars, and at Stonehenge and elsewhere, Celtic Druid sites. And I want to talk a bit about the question of European culture and identity and the future of Europe after or because of the referendum in the UK about Brexit. I want to talk about that. Now, I'm coming from a metaphysical, spiritual place. If you've listened to my last talk, you'll know about the philosophical perspective I'm coming from. And I'm an interfaith specialist. I'm interested in comparative global metaphysics of peace. And my concern about the current state of Europe and Britain and their relations, put in the global picture, is which kind of formula, what solution is going to most lead to peace. And I want to talk about the implications of Brexit and its implementation or non-implementation, only really from a philosophical perspective. I'm not talking in the sense of narrow-minded politics. I'm trying to get an overview here. At the time of that referendum on whether Britain should remain in the European Union, I thought it through very carefully. I was living in Scotland, and I actually applied a system of complex decision-making that I use called the ethical calculus. It's a system that I've invented, devised. It's a kind of application of a mixture of utilitarian ethics, Bentham inspired, that you weigh up the maximal happiness that will be caused by certain choices and decisions, and then you quantify that literally. It's a technical form of making complex decisions. I applied this to the question of whether Britain should leave the European Union or not, and came to the conclusion mathematically that it would be in Britain's interest of long-term happiness, both of this generation and future generations, if we were to remain inside the European Union and reform it from within. Obviously there are things wrong with the European Union. We know that. No institution is perfect. It's become overweening, it's over-centralised, its power. Bureaucrats in Brussels are paid far too much and take up far too much of taxpayers' money across Europe, and especially when Europe was plunging into economic difficulty, as we saw in Greece. I think this is one of the things that disaffected voters in Britain against staying inside the European Union. And I have here the book by Varoufakis, who was responsible for negotiating the deals between Greece and the European Union, and he reveals, that they were pretty arrogant, these European officials. That, I think, all has to change. Europe has to totally remodel the way that it organises its European Union. But the concept, I think, is very important and worth preserving. So, like Varoufakis, I'm saying keep it together, but change it. I'm saying let's go back to basics. Let's go back to the founding fathers and the visionaries who created the European Union. If you look at this wonderful book, The Dictionary of Internationalists, edited by Warren Cool, all the key architects of the European Union, like Monnet and Schuman and so on, are here in detail. And these people were visionaries. They wanted a European Union that would remove forever the possibility that Europe would have yet another continental-wide war. They'd lived through, most of these founding fathers, 2 world wars, fought out on Europe's soil. And the battlefields, the casualties and so on, are not really known by anyone unless they lived through it or have studied history like I have in detail. And I nursed Canadian soldiers who fought in World War I when I was in my 20s, which influenced my subsequent career as a peace activist and peace theorist. I came back deliberately from Canada to help prevent World War III. At that time, the Cold War was raging between the then USSR and the West Bloc. And so we successfully kind of helped mediate that with philosophers of peace. Myself and a group of philosophers from different countries managed to get the intellectuals of East and West Bloc talking, and we played our role. But the European Union was visioned as a structure, an architectonic, to prevent war happening again. Jean Monnet, the founder, one of the great founders, 1888 to 1979, had been a Deputy Secretary General of the League of Nations. And during the war, he was actually positioned in New York as a member of the British Supply Council for a while. He was on the French Committee of National Liberation from 1943 onwards, and was a serious visionary. He actually inspired Winston Churchill's proposal in 1940 when France was attacked by the Nazis. Winston Churchill proposed the immediate fusion of France and Britain, and that was Jean Monnet's talking to Churchill. That shows how much Winston Churchill was a Francophile, and he wanted a united Europe, but not one in the Nazi mould, and that's why he opposed Hitler with such vigour and resolve. So I think that the people that set up the EU, like Jean Monnet and the others, were peace visionaries trying to make Europe immune from future wars. Unfortunately, of course, we haven't been as successful as we'd like, and the European Union, I think, showed real lack of vision over the issue of the breakup of Yugoslavia. And this is another reason why British voters were disaffected with it. What use is the European Union if it can't even stop a civil war breaking out on its doorstep? We watched in horror as Yugoslavia went up in flames, and the European Union seemed to be getting muddled into it in the wrong kind of way by offering membership to some of the breakaway parts of former Yugoslavia, initially Slovenia, Croatia, and so on. And I don't know why the European Union allowed it to happen. That Yugoslav civil war was horrendous. Its psychic traumas are still with us, and large parts of the Balkans are still in ruins. What I would have done if I'd have been anywhere near influence and power at the time, I was just a young academic peace studies expert at the University of London, although I did organise a meeting in London about the Balkans, and I did do my best to try and get all sides talking and so on, but obviously I didn't have my fingers anywhere near actual power. I seem to remember Douglas Hurd was the Britain Foreign Secretary at the time, Conservative, and although he's an intelligent man, I think he completely failed to grasp what needed to be done. In my view, what should have been done was the European Union and the other powers, America and so on, should have said to Yugoslavian breakaway states, as they were on the verge of breaking away, you can join the European Union if you stay together as one country, Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia as a whole can join the EU within an agreed time period, 15-year transition, but only if you remain together and avoid conflict. Yugoslavia was an advanced economy, it was a socialist economy, but had moved a long way away from any kind of Stalinist central control economy. And if Poland was suitable for membership of the EU, then certainly Yugoslavia was. Poland was even more centralised. So if the EU had said to Yugoslavia, you can join, but you have to stay together, and here's some funding to sweeten that process so that, yes, regional differentiation for places like Slovenia and Macedonia and Croatia and so on, but not complete severance. Then Yugoslavia would have stayed together and it could have been collectively a member of the European Union. And that would have happened, and none of that fighting would have gone on. I did actually call for this at the time because I was coordinating the European Philosophers of Peace, right? But of course, the trouble is that the politicians, the statesmen, each of them from their own narrow nationalist egocentric perspective, seem to lack the statesmanship that's required. As a philosopher, I'm interested in as I said, training the next generation of statesmen to think long-term about these problems. Totally failed over Yugoslavia. Let's also now look at Ukraine. Again, the European Union has failed abysmally. We've watched in horror as the Ukraine has kind of bifurcated into a pro-European Union, pro-Western bloc, pro-American, who want total severance from Russia and all that. And then there's the Russian-speaking majority in the east of the country that want to remain close allies and associates of Russia, whose economy is much more plugged into Russia. So the result is a civil war, which is going on to this day, as thousands of people are being shelled, bombed, misplaced, killed, cities are being torn apart, and the psyche of the country is torn apart. What I'm interested in is the metaphysics of this, and it's the soul of Ukraine that is being tortured here. And one side calls the other Stalinists, the other side calls the others fascists. You know, it's extreme rhetoric of hatred going on. But these are people that up until a few years ago were fellow citizens and lived happily together and worked in the same factories or hotels or whatever. Ukraine is an amazing country and has a very, very deep metaphysical history. Not only Christian, Kiev was the first great Slavic city to become Christian, but the Kabbalistic tradition of the Jews was very, very strongly influenced by the great Kabbalistic thinkers of the Ukraine. Some of the Baal Shem Tov and some of these very, very great Kabbalists came from the Ukraine. And in their memory, in their name, you see the Kabbalah, like Christianity, is all about our separate souls, which are scattered and torn apart, finding unity again, tikkun, wholeness, and going back to the one light, going back to God ultimately through prayer. And God is defined as the ultimate unity here. And so applying that supernatural spiritual wisdom of the Kabbalah to conflict situations like in Ukraine or Yugoslavia, the only principle we can apply is that of unity. At the emotional level, that is love. At the intellectual level, that is perceived as unity. But it's the same principle that we emotionally sense as love. So what I'm talking here in this series of sharings is how we can apply the metaphysics of love to these terrible conflicts that are going on in the world. Okay, because everybody's got some angle, everybody's against somebody else. And you listen to the debate, for instance, during the Brexit referendum, and both sides became very heated and against each other. I want to look at this from the metaphysics of love and say, where is truth? Because to me, truth is that intellectual perception of unity. Truth is when you work out in mathematics the accurate answer to a puzzle. You calculate, you do the equations, you get the answer. That's the true answer. Other answers are false. I believe, like Hobbes and like Montesquieu and like other political philosophers, that it is possible to calculate the ethics of political decisions and calculate the eventual impact on the collective happiness of a given situation. And I believe that what I'm saying here is mathematically true in terms of the metaphysics of politics. So I think the most important thing, a duty of any statesman or stateswoman, is to preserve the unity of their country. And if I'd have been, as I say, involved with the negotiations over Yugoslavia, I think the West utterly let Yugoslavia down. We should never have allowed it to sink into that chaos of competing nationalisms in which religious culture and ethnic identity then resurged. Yugoslavia had worked as a federal compilation of peoples. I've spoken 3 times in Struga at the Poetry Festival because I'm also a poet. And that was founded under the old Yugoslav system. Struga Poetry Festival was a federal cultural initiative. It's now being carried on by the Macedonian government. And I met the former Macedonian president who said how proud he was to welcome us international poets and that Macedonia would continue to fly the flag of this as a haven of international cultural rationality. Pablo Neruda, one of the great poets of our time, won it. Ted Hughes won it. And it was a great honour to be invited as a poet. But the tragedy is that it fell apart. And so we have this moral duty to preserve intact a country. My concern, and I'm looking now at the very long-term future of the United Kingdom, I'm not interested in the coming election or which party is in power or whatever. I'm looking at the long-term effects of Brexit on the history and future of the United Kingdom. I'm a specialist in long-term history, and I've studied the history of Europe for many years. That's what my degrees are in. I've travelled to just about every country in Europe. I know the UK like the back of my hand. I've travelled and taught in every part of it. Wales I lived in for 10 years. I've lived in Scotland for 7 years. I've lived in England for many years. And I visited Ireland many times, both south and north of the border. And I know Cornwall and other parts of East Anglia and so on. So what I'm going to say about the future of the UK comes from a metaphysical concern about the nature of love. The UK, for all its complexity as a country, has succeeded in staying together since 1603, when King James I of Great Britain, or King James VI of Scotland, became the king of the United Domains of Scotland, England and Wales and Northern Ireland. And so the idea behind that union of the crowns, as it was called in 1603, was to create a little country that a lot of visionary idealists thought would be like a microcosm of hope for the planet. It was a time of Shakespeare, it was a time of great flourishing of the arts and of the sciences. It was the time when Lord Francis Bacon was developing scientific method. He dedicated the advancement of learning to King James. And it was a visionary time when the genius of the English, the Welsh, the Scots and the Irish worked together. By designing the flag, which was James's idea, he brought together the flags of the different saints of those countries, St George and St Andrew for Scotland, St Patrick. And that's what the United Kingdom flag is. It's the union of these separate countries. And it's very interesting, it's the flags of the saints, because the idea of the United Kingdom in James's mind, and he was head of the church of the whole country, he'd inherited from Elizabeth, his predecessor, was really an isle of united saints, actually. If you live in Wales, as I used to, and go on retreat to Bardsey Island, it's called the Isle of the Saints. The old Welsh church was deeply spiritual, and the Druid and Celtic pagan culture had made a seamless transition into Christian Druid culture, if you want. And the great saints of Wales, like Padarn, who's one of my heroes, who was near Aberystwyth, these were amazing visionaries. So marry that lot up to the saints of Scotland, St Columba, and all the other saints of the Scottish tradition, which many of whom had come from Ireland, like Columba. Marry that to the Anglo-Saxon saints of the English, and there's a whole long list of amazing saints in England, going right back to St Alban, who was martyred actually on this day, the 20th of June, it's his saint's day. And what James, he was a humble man, actually, James, although intellectually brilliant. And Francis Bacon, when he dedicated the advancement of learning, said, he called him the new Solomon. James was a highly intellectual man. He'd been trained, he was baptised a Catholic Christian. His mother, of course, was Mary Queen of Scots, who was herself an amazing woman. But he was raised as a Protestant, so he was both. He was an ecumenical Christian, as I think actually is the only sensible thing to be. And he wanted peace between Catholic and Protestant. So later he married his son to a Catholic princess in Europe, and he married his daughter to a Protestant actually emperor, who became the Emperor Frederick of the Palatinate. So James was trying his vision for peace in Europe, which was significant, he was a pan-European peace thinker, was that Catholic and Protestant should unite, there should be harmony between the different branches of Christianity. It should be achieved through love, which is why he married off different parts of his family to both sides, okay? And the Anglican position under James was to be both Catholic and Protestant simultaneously. Why can't you have the best bits of Protestant faith and the best bits of Catholic faith together? That was James's vision. And he wanted the United Kingdom to be like an example for that. And Inigo Jones painted the banqueting hall ceiling in Whitehall at his behest, and that of his son Charles, who inherited, with the image of peace, the images of peace on the ceiling. It's one of the great masterpieces of British art. Now, why am I saying this? Well, because we're at risk of breaking all that up. That's a legacy that's lasted 400 years. The implication, you see, my vision as a metaphysician of love is that the people that crafted the United Kingdom brought it into existence. Again, it wasn't perfect, but it was better than the continual wars that it replaced. The English and the Scots used to hate each other. They used to fight wars on the border regularly for hundreds of years, quite lethal wars too. The Scots would raid, the English would raid back, and so on. They'd kill each other. The Welsh and the English did exactly the same. I lived in Montgomeryshire for many years, near Montgomery, where Lord Herbert was based, the great philosopher of truth, who's inspired my work. Lord Herbert of Cherbury, and I've been back and forth the Welsh-English border. I've actually written an encyclopedia on the cultural history of the Welsh Marches. And for hundreds of years, the Welsh and the English fought each other. Llewellyn the Great and many others fought the English. And the English would raid into Wales, and the Norman French attacked, and so on. Eventually, these wars came to an end because of the political unification of these regions. So after the Tudor dynasty came into power, the English and the Welsh didn't fight again, because the Tudors were actually a Welsh dynasty who were welcomed from Anglesey, their heartland, which was the heartland of the Druids. The Tudors were like, as it were, Druids in the court in London. And Queen Elizabeth, as a Tudor, knew this. This is why she liked John Dee, who was her Druid at the court. So this Anglesey family of Tudors became the monarchs of the United Kingdoms of Wales, England. And that brought peace between Wales and England. It was a masterpiece. It was brilliant. But that's what true statesmen do. They try and get peace through unity. Then it was extended, after Elizabeth's death, through the unification with Scotland, which again brought peace and an end to those border wars. So the implications, let me just explain, because some people don't realise this. Many people that voted in that referendum weren't given the true facts of the matter, and there was a whole lot of disinformation given out by the press for its own agendas. The implications of Brexit are the following: that in the referendum, which was only ever an advisory referendum, it had no legal binding status in its implications. If the decision, which was by a small, very small majority of the people that voted, chose to leave in aggregate, if you weigh up all the votes, the European Union. If you look at the total number of people that didn't vote or had spoiled ballots or whatever, and I was one of them, my ballot was returned unopened, my vote never counted, for reasons that are utterly inexplicable. It seemed to have been tampered with. And I know that many people in Europe were the same. They voted, but their votes never counted. So let's say if you looked at the total number of potential voters and then the number who actually voted to come out, it's actually quite a small minority of the total numbers of voters who could have voted, who actually voted to leave. For some reason, in my case it was, I don't know, vote tampering, interference, postal delays, possible deliberate vote tampering and obstruction. An awful lot of votes were never counted in. Of those that were counted, a tiny small minority voted to come out. However, the majority of the voters of Scotland voted to stay in the European Union. And the majority of the voters in Northern Ireland also voted to stay in the European Union. Why? Well, let's just remember, as I said at the very beginning of this talk, why the European Union was created was to prevent war and violence and to bring peace. And it's capable of reform. All we need is a few statesman-like people to step up and just go and talk the truth in Strasbourg and Brussels. If Churchill was alive today, he'd be doing that. We need his equivalent to be reforming the European Union. Why did the people of Scotland and Northern Ireland vote for it? Well, in Northern Ireland, they voted to stay in the European Union because the fact that Southern Ireland and Northern Ireland are both members of the European Union has meant that the war and violence that troubled Northern Ireland particularly for many, many years was able finally to be put to rest. the fact that both were in the European Union meant that peace funding was available. I know many groups in Northern Ireland who receive peace funding. Peace studies flourishes in both north and south of the border. And it's, as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, which I set up back in the 2000s, I've watched, the success of the peace process in Northern Ireland. And Martin McGuinness, unfortunately, who's now dead, and other responsible leaders, I think, moved away from using violence. There was a realization that violence isn't going to solve the problems. They were assured under the Good Friday Agreement that if there's any future change to the constitution of Northern Ireland, it would be put to a referendum. And therefore the legal requirement is that the people of Northern Ireland be given a referendum choice in which, and this ought by law to happen before Brexit is implemented, they should be given the option to rejoin the south of Ireland in one future republic. Now this is of course totally downplayed by the media. Hardly anyone ever mentions this, which to me is a scandal of lack of intelligence among our journalists. In Europe it's mentioned, and the European Union and other European thinkers have said that if there was such a referendum, and if the people of Northern Ireland wanted to stay in the European Union and voted to join the Republic, as is their constitutional right and legal right, that the European Union would agree to that. It wouldn't put any obstacles in the way. And the model is that of Germany. You see, when East Germany united with West Germany in 1990, overnight, suddenly, East Germany immediately became a member of the European Union because the state that it joined, West Germany, was already a member of the European Union. So that precedence has been discussed by political scientists and lawyers in Europe. That's what would happen over Ireland if the people of Northern Ireland voted. Now, I think the chances are probably about 85%, possibly even more, that the people of Northern Ireland would vote to join the South and to remain in the European Union. Why is it so high? Well, I think that the majority of people in Northern Ireland, although obviously it's a difficult decision, right? Because some of them will want to stay in the UK because they're romantically attached to it and their cultural identity as unionists is bound up with that. So they will vote as a bloc to remain. But demographically, the greater bloc are the people that are seeking for the reunification of Ireland. And I think that most people in Northern Ireland realise that the European Union has been pretty good news for Ireland as a whole. Obviously there are problems and with economic difficulties that the Republic has faced in recent years. There's less excitement about being in the EU, and so it would be it would obviously be, you can't predict these things, but I think somewhere around about 80%, I predict, if that referendum happened, would vote to remain in the European Union and to reunite Ireland. So the risk, let's just calculate that. Let's just sort of stop, pause, rewind. You see, what it means is the United Kingdom might continue, but it would lose the Northern Ireland bit. So instead of talking about the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, the state, which we call the UK, would now have to be changed in law everywhere. It would be the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Okay, well, okay, fine, so what, people will say. And the Irish would probably be delighted. I'm quarter Irish myself, and I think part of me, the Irish bit of me would be very happy to see United Ireland. It's a great country, and I know quite a lot about its history and culture, and particularly the Druid and early Christian history. Many people have spilt a lot of blood to get Ireland united, so that would be a good outcome if you want. But what about the rest of the UK? Well, then there's Scotland. So, you see, when I lived in Scotland for 7 years, I hadn't realised, I think it was an eye-opener to me, how deeply embedded Scottish nationalism had become in the national psyche of Scotland. I'd never really thought seriously about Scottish nationalism as a political issue. Being British, identified as British Canadian, I've always been proud of and I loved all the parts of my country. So I love Britain all over, England, Scotland, Wales. I used to go to Scotland for summer camps. I've always loved its scenery, and the few Scots I've known, I'd always loved very much and found them amazing people. When I moved to Scotland in 2000, I was confronted by something I hadn't really factored into my equation, but I rapidly increased my understanding, was there is a very strong element in Scottish psyche that is very strongly pro-Scottish nationalism. And to begin with, I didn't understand it. I found it very annoying, actually, because I was accused of being English, so to speak. And I don't regard myself as English. I think of myself as British, Canadian, globalistic, European. But because I have an English accent, don't have a Scottish accent, I was pigeonholed. And all I can say is I did get quite a lot of racist abuse from the Scots. And I found, there's a very strong anti-English animus in Scotland these days, which people from England don't realise. They've never experienced it, they've never been up there. Very few English people actually make it up to Scotland. I explored a lot of it and got to know people at all different classes in society. And when the referendum happened on Scottish independence from the UK, it was a very, very tight result. And nobody quite knew how it was going to go. One of the reasons that the Let's Keep the UK Together lobby won was because the argument was then floated from Westminster in the press. If you leave the UK, Scotland, you will then automatically leave the European Union. That'll be it. And we won't let you get back in. Your membership will be blocked because we, the remainder of the UK, won't let you come in as a separate nation. Because member states of the European Union have the right to block new states from applying for membership. So, for example, this is what Spain has said about Catalonia. If Catalonia ever did want to become fully independent like a country, well, Spain would have the legal right to block it from ever becoming a member for decades. That was what the UK government and the press in Westminster all hurled against the Scottish nationalists and said, you dare leave the UK, that's it, you're on your own, you're outside Europe. And I think a lot of Scots got frightened by that. It helped swing it so that the Let's Stay in the UK vote won. But as I said, it was very, very close. My view is that now that argument is completely without foundation. That argument has been proved to be false. It was a manipulative and deceitful argument. Because the actual fact now is that the people of Scotland, who by and large are very pro-European, they may not like the English very much. And the more I researched it, by the way, the more I discovered why. If you go into the history of the Highland clearances, if you go into the history of the way that the English, in a sense, occupied Scotland after Culloden and banished the kilt and banished all the elements of Scottish Gaelic culture, it was pretty brutal. And if you read some of the actual historical studies of the Highland clearances, these English soldiers would turn up at remote villages in the Gaelic Highlands and, literally round up the men and women and take them away and burn the villages. It was genocide. It was ethnic genocide against the Gaelic inhabitants of Scotland. And they remember. A couple of hundred years is not a long time in terms of family history. It's what my great-grandfather remembered from his great-grandfather telling him. And so there's a lot of, I think, rightful resentment among the Scots against the way the English treated them. And their vision is an independent Scotland which would play a mature role as a voice for peace and sanity in the world. They don't like the United Kingdom's belligerent, bellicose, war-making policies. They don't like Britain's nuclear weapons fleet that's all parked up in Scotland. They want to get rid of that. And most of the Scottish nationalists, as I got to know them and got over the shock, I realised what incredible people they are. They're visionary Europeans, peace thinkers,